Evolution Part 1, Natural Selection Explained Exactly 400 Ways. Nope, just kidding. But it will probably feel like that because when I go through some of the history, you're going to realize that you actually have some big misconceptions about what natural selection is and what survival of the fittest means. And we're going to go through some of those because it's important to realize what your previous thoughts were about this stuff, and then it'll stick forever about what it really is. And then in part 2, we'll go through the evidence of evolution, those 5 areas of evidence that we've been talking about, DNA and the homologous structures, etc. But for this one, we're going to go through some of the history and then Darwin and his pieces, and then what natural selection is and how to think about it in context so that you can explain it in an open response or be able to apply it. Let's start with the most basic thing. Let's define evolution. Evolution is change. Oopsie. That's an E. Over time. And when we're talking about change over time and evolution, we're talking about a big, long time. And we're really talking about the process here of how modern organisms descended from ancient organisms. And that's the bottom line of what we're trying to explain here. And although people might have had a hunch about how species were related, it was a tough thing to prove for a long time. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the early ideas. So, talk about Lamarck. He was a contemporary of Darwin, who was the major dude for evolution. But Lamarck's main book came out in 1830, I think. Oh, no, 1802, something like that. Anyway, somewhere around there. And but he was really all about animals. He studied animals, and he was about taxonomy, classification of animals. So he studied vertebrates. And so, but he had a passage in his main book about evolution. So he's the first one to really come up with a comprehensive theory about evolution. And his main deal that has followed him all along into history, into biology books, is the idea that you inherit acquired characteristics. So you inherit acquired characteristics. In other words, if I become very muscular in my right arm, then my children will be born with muscular right arms that they'll have in life. And he called it the use or disuse. So if you use a part of your body, then your offspring will have that part. And if you don't use it, they will not have that part. So kind of a use it or lose it part. So I used to joke about trying to evolve to have a tooth that would open plastic stuff. Like, when you get electronics and it has that super duper strong plastic stuff around it that you can't open with anything. And so you have to wait until you have a really sharp knife or a sharp pair of scissors to open your electronic thing when you really want to open it as soon as you get to the car. So then when I learned about Lamarck, I started calling it my Lamarckian tooth for opening plastic, because I thought every time I tried to use my teeth to open plastic, I was getting closer to evolving to have a Lamarckian tooth. So by his idea, every time I used my teeth to try to open plastic, I was getting closer to gaining a tooth specially made for opening plastic. And for sure, my kids would have teeth for ripping opening plastic. So that's my Lamarckian tooth for opening plastic theory. So, I mean, it seems ridiculous when you put it in that context, but a lot of us do think that way. Like, we think if we are super fit, that we will have kids who are super fit. Like, there are things we think that if we do, it will change the way our offspring are. So it sounds silly when we talk about growing a tooth for opening plastic things, but there's a lot of things we do think carry on to our offspring that don't. Because we know that our offspring only get a mixture of the genes that we have, and it's a randomized mixture. So along comes Charlie Darwin, the dude, the evolution dude. All right, so he goes sailing around the world in 1830 when he's like 19 or 20 years old, which, if you can imagine doing that, leading a voyage at 20 years old around the world to study biology. And he goes everywhere and notes all the species he sees. He writes down details of every fossil he finds, and begins forming this theory about things because he sees all these similarities between things he finds in dramatically different places. And then he spends a lot of time on the Galapagos Islands off of South America. And so that's why the finches are over here. Let's get my little star thingy. Star thing. There we go. So the finches are over here because he didn't really know what they were at first. He had to find out, but he saw a bunch of finches that all kind of looked the same, but they had different shaped beaks, and they were all in sort of different places and all eating different things, but the only thing that was different about them was their beaks because of what they were eating. And so that was kind of leading towards this idea that that something had changed, that there was a relationship between the shape of the beak and the food source, right? And so then in 1859, like 30 years later, he writes the book Origin of Species to explain all this and put it all together, this big theory of evolution and natural selection. Because before this, with Lamarck and stuff being so popular, and people believe that one species just turned into another. So you had that use or disuse and the inherited characteristics, and you were just, 1 minute you were a mouse and then you were a rat. It just turned from one species to another, and poof, that's all that was to it. Just sort of transformed. There was no mechanism about it. And it really wasn't fully accepted until well into 1930. Okay, so these were Darwin's 4 big ideas. So after all his observations of looking at organisms and fossils and geography, or geology, excuse me. So variation exists between individuals of a species. So in looking at, say, a bunch of tortoises, he saw there was great variation that individuals of a species were incredibly unique, that individuals compete for resources in a given ecosystem, that there's not quite enough food and space, that they have to compete with each other, that competition leads to death for some individuals and others will survive. And that individuals with the most favorable variations are likely to survive and reproduce. So those favorable variations came later to be called adaptations. Sorry about the handwriting. Okay, and this entire process, all right, gets kind of sorted out later to be called natural selection. Although I'm going to say much more specifically exactly how nature does the selecting in a little bit. Maybe for the next one, because this video is getting long and I like to keep them short and sweet. Okay, so that's it for this slide. This fits with one of the questions, by the way. So Darwin's finches help us kind of understand the big picture of how Darwin put together some of these ideas. So looking at a whole bunch of different beaks, he was able to notice that the characteristics, well, he saw it with many animals and plants, varied on the islands of Galapagos. And so my little wonderful picture here of the Galapagos Islands here shows you how you can imagine that different species could become isolated, even though, as you know, maybe from Pangea and how the continents spread apart, they might have all once been together. So there may have originally been, for finches, a common ancestor, and this is a term we use a lot when we talk about evolution, a common ancestor, and then they broke into many different species of finches when they became geographically isolated. That's not a term you have to know, but I'm just explaining it. Geographically isolated and became their own species. So all these different species of finches, finch 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that have all different beaks related to the different food on the different islands. Okay. All started from perhaps one common ancestor, and then as the land split apart, they evolved over a long period of time to be different than each other and became different species entirely. And to be what we call a biological different species means that if you're a different species, you can't mate and create the same species that would then mate and create the same species. So that would mean that these two, that one, finch 1 and finch 2, couldn't get together and create finch 1.5 or something. But finch 1 plus finch 1 get together and their offspring are finch 1. And finch 2 plus finch 2, their offspring is finch 2. That's what makes them individual species. Okay, so if finch 1 and finch 2 get together, they may not be able to have offspring at all, or their offspring is unable to have offspring of its own. So that's how we know something is a separate species. So they're not just like cousins, okay? They're entirely different species with a common ancestor. But he noticed how incredibly similar they were. And how they differed was their beaks and that they were on different islands. So there was a relationship there. And this was the kind of stuff that he noticed on his journey that led him to draw some conclusions about how species were related in terms of their ancestors and how species might have evolved over time. And so that's the end of this history and introduction to part 1 of evolution.